Jeff Stone, who's the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. He's co-chair of the Chicago Lawyer Chapter Board of Advisors, and he's a member of ACS's National Board of Advisors.
So I think I'll talk a little bit about the Senate and the judiciary, and particularly the Supreme Court. And the day after the election, I had been scheduled to indeed give a talk to the ACS chapter at Notre Dame. And the talk was about this very subject. And I expected, since I assumed the day before that the outcome of the election would be different from what turned out, to give a very upbeat and inspiring talk about how fortunate they were to be coming out of law school at a time when we would have a Justice Garland replacing a Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court, when the three most senior justices, Ginsburg, Breyer, and Kennedy, who would likely leave over the next 4 years, would be replaced by President Clinton, and that they would be in a new era of constitutional law that would enable the court and enable the society to move to new places. Unfortunately, of course, when I got there, I had to say, this is what I was hoping to tell you, and now I have to tell you something which is really pretty dire. So what I want to do is say a little bit about that problem that we now face, and I think it's the product of a couple of factors. First thing to keep in mind is we should not forget how unbelievably conservative the Supreme Court has become over the years. 13 of the last 17 justices have been appointed by Republican presidents. Given the current makeup of the court, which more or less I believe mirrors what it was in the recent past, with Gorsuch replacing Scalia, is the most conservative Supreme Court in at least 70 or 80 years, and maybe well beyond that. And we've come to sort of take it kind of for granted because we've gotten used to it. But this is a Supreme Court. It's important to remember that it's held unconstitutional. This is not judicial restraint. It's held unconstitutional. Affirmative action, gun regulations, campaign finance reform, the Voting Rights Act, on and on and on, in ways that clearly reflect a strong ideological conservative bent in terms of what they've imparted into the Constitution, and it's only going to get worse. So one question about this is how this happened, and here I want to put the Senate into play, because one of the realities is the manipulation of the filibuster process. It is, I think, one of the real tragedies of the Senate's history. From 1952 until 2013, roughly 61 years, the filibuster was used on a total of 90 occasions to interfere with the president's ability to make a federal appointment. 72 of those 90 occurred in the 4 years of the first term of President Obama's presidency. That is, in that 4-year period, 78% of all of the filibusters in the 60-year period occurred. That was completely, obviously unprecedented, unprincipled, and had a dramatic impact upon the president's ability to make appointments, and particularly to the judiciary. When the Democrats finally, correctly, in 2013, eliminated the filibuster from presidential appointments other than the Supreme Court, they did so not because the filibuster had proved historically to be a bad idea in this context, but because the Republicans had completely abused this device in a way that had never been done before. It was unconscionable. And they were right at that point to say, this is the device that's meant to be a safeguard, which is now being used to simply block appointments because the minority of the Senate doesn't like the president's nominees. And they didn't extend the filibuster to the Supreme Court because there had been no history of abuse of the filibuster with respect to Supreme Court nominees. And they could have done that. It was in their interest to do that, because if Obama did have another nominee, the Republicans could have filibustered. But the Democrats actually, in a principled way, set that aside and said, we're not going to eliminate the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. So then we have, of course, the nomination of Merrick Garland after Justice Scalia's passing. And in nominating Garland, obviously Obama appointed someone who was a good deal more moderate than his two prior nominees, Kagan and Sotomayor, who were both themselves relatively moderate liberals, but Garland clearly much more so. Also, a nominee who is older than any person who's been nominated to the Supreme Court in 60 years, with the exception of Justice Powell, who's the same age. And he did this in order to basically find a compromise and to offer someone who the Republicans could comfortably live with. But instead of accepting that, McConnell and his Senate cronies basically came up with this idiotic idea that was completely ahistorical, that said the president should not be allowed to appoint Supreme Court justices in the final year of their term. 13 prior presidents had in fact done that, including such insignificant characters as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan. No, this has never happened before. This is unprecedented. And the reason they did this was obviously in the hope that a Republican would be elected president in 2016 and that he would have the opportunity to replace Scalia with another very conservative justice. And in fact, it turned out that way. And then, of course, when the Democrats indicated they might filibuster Gorsuch's nomination, not because Gorsuch himself was necessarily unqualified or otherwise an inappropriate nominee, but because of the way they'd gotten to that point. The Republicans then, of course, got rid of the filibuster when it came to Supreme Court nominees without batting an eye. And so we've gotten to this point in a way that, when we look at it historically, is really pretty depressing and unprincipled. And part of what's depressing about it is the failure of the Obama administration and the failure of the media to make an issue of this the way they should have. And I believe they didn't, mainly because they figured Clinton was going to win anyway, so it wasn't really worth spending any capital on. But I think that was a terrible mistake. And we now face a situation where the three oldest justices on the court, Kennedy, Ginsburg, and Breyer, at least one of them, I would guess, is likely to step down in the next couple of years, either for reasons of health or otherwise. There's already rumors about Kennedy to that effect. If and when that happens, Trump will get to nominate another Alito, Gorsuch type of justice. There will be no way of stopping that at all. And we will then have by far the most conservative Supreme Court, as far as I'm concerned, in history. The swing justice will no longer be Anthony Kennedy, but John Roberts. John Roberts is thought to be a moderate because he cast one moderate vote in his entire career so far on highly ideological cases. And a lot of important precedents will be at stake. And the one I want to mention, which I think is most concerning, is Roe v. Wade. I do believe that if Trump gets another nominee, that new 5-member majority will overrule Roe v. Wade. And I think that the absence of a really strong movement today about abortion is a terrible absence in our polity. There was a strong political movement in the late 60s and early 70s about women's right to choose. That made a huge difference, and it made a huge difference on the Supreme Court. I was there as a law clerk to Justice Brennan that year, and there's no doubt that the views of the justices were informed by the extent to which there was this powerful, strong, not only movement for the right, but also an understanding of what the world was like when there was no such right, and how demeaning and dangerous that was for women. That has largely disappeared in American politics. It's all come from the other side ever since then. For the moral majority, yes, it has. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It has. And I think it is imperative that if we want to have any hope of keeping Roe v. Wade, that a really strong and powerful pro-choice movement, again, come to the fore. And right now, I think that is not the case. We can disagree on this. But I don't think this is an issue that most Americans think of as terribly critical. And I think that's potentially disastrous. We can disagree.